Hello, John here, and today we're talking about lone worker safety. And not in a fluffy, make sure you do a risk assessment sense. We're going to be talking about actually the biggest operational problem sitting underneath most lone worker incidents, which is this. When something goes wrong, it's invisible for far too long. So in this walkthrough, I'm going to show you how you can reduce response times to lone worker incidents by up to an hour, and that's by building 7 easy automations that run in the background without any extra heavy lifting from you or your team. But first, let's start by defining lone workers. So a lone worker is anyone who works without close or direct physical supervision. And that covers a lot of people. For example, people who open or close buildings on their own, people who visit clients or patients alone, security guards patrolling sites out of hours, engineers responding to call-outs without a colleague present, or staff travelling between locations independently. And if you're thinking, yeah, that's half my workforce, well, that's not really a surprise. According to the British Safety Council, around 1 in 5 workers in the UK regularly works alone. Now, lone workers tend to be capable, independent, and trustworthy, but they're also one of the most vulnerable groups of workers you employ. Partly that's because working alone opens you up to different kinds of risks. But mostly it's because when something does go wrong, there's no immediate visibility, meaning a slower response time and a more serious outcome. Now, the legal side of this is very clear. As an employer, you're responsible for managing health and safety risks before you let people work alone. And that applies to anyone contracted to work for you, including self-employed people. But the traditional controls most organizations use, so that's manual periodic supervision, scheduled check-ins, or relying on workers to raise the alarm when something goes wrong, well, they leave gaps. They may help you to tick a few boxes that say you have a procedure in place, but in hard practical terms, they actually leave a lot of gaps, and your lone workers may even feel more vulnerable, unprotected, and unsafe as a result. So, this walkthrough is about how to close those gaps by using simple signals. And from these signals, you're going to build 7 automations that detect risk earlier and more reliably in the exact areas where traditional lone worker safety processes break down. But to help you understand why these automations are so important, I want to first look at what actually goes wrong when people work alone. So first, physical injury and medical emergencies. So that's slips, trips, falls, manual handling injuries, sudden illness. Now, these things happen everywhere, even when people work in pairs or in groups. But the difference for a lone worker is that there's no immediate help, no one to notice. And if the person is incapacitated, they may not be able to call for help at all. And that risk increases further when people are working in places you don't control. So places such as client sites, patient homes, public spaces. In these places, you don't get to set the conditions or remove the hazards in advance. So the second risk for lone workers is violence, aggression, and confrontation. Lone workers are often dealing directly with the public, with patients, or with clients, and without any backup, which means confrontation is more dangerous. And actually, the risk of confrontation is generally higher for lone workers too, because it's easier to argue with somebody who doesn't have any support. So the traditional way to support this is by giving workers a panic alarm. However, in moments of confrontation or high tensions, pressing an alarm isn't always safe. If someone is escalating, then pulling out a phone or visibly calling for help can make that situation worse. Or the worker might be prevented from raising an alarm altogether. So incidents unfold without any external awareness until after the conflict has come to some sort of resolution. The third reason things go wrong for lone workers is stress, fatigue, and isolation. So this one is less visible, but it's persistent. Research shows that working alone for prolonged periods of time can increase stress and fatigue, and those things both impair judgment. So they increase the likelihood of mistakes, and they make it more likely that a small problem turns into a bigger one. And because lone workers have fewer informal check-ins with colleagues or managers, so those are just chats that you might have in passing or small talk in between jobs, those issues are harder to spot early on and only tend to surface when they've got particularly bad. Across all 3 of those categories, the common weakness is the same: delayed awareness. So traditional lone worker controls assume that alarms will be raised when needed, or that someone will notice quickly if they aren't. But when monitoring depends on manual action, gaps are inevitable. So maybe a manager forgets to call a lone worker to check in on them partway through their shift. Or maybe a lone worker calls for help but their supervisor misses that call. And suddenly there's no context behind what that missed call actually means. Were they calling to request a holiday? Were they calling to ask a question? Were they calling because they need help? All of this leads to delay, which is worrying because when something goes wrong with a lone worker, time is the most expensive variable in the system, not just financially, but operationally, legally, and even just humanely. On the subject of costs, it's sometimes hard to put figures on this, but let's start with the direct cost of delay. So in the UK, workplace injury and ill health costs employers and society around £23 billion a year. That's a hard figure to grasp because it's just so big and impersonal. So maybe it's more helpful if I tell you that a single non-fatal workplace injury costs, on average, around £10,000. But once that incident leads to more than 7 days off work, the cost jumps to more like £40,000, often even more. And that's before you even consider legal fees, fines, or reputational damage. A delayed response is one of the main reasons incidents cross that line. On top of that, you've got the productivity impact. So this is often underestimated, but every year over 40 million working days are lost due to workplace injury and work-related ill health. So lone worker incidents tend to be especially disruptive here because they're discovered late, harder to reconstruct, and more likely to lead to investigation or escalation. But the cost doesn't stop with the injured worker, so shifts need covering at short notices, services get disrupted, supervisors get pulled into reactive firefighting instead of running the operations. And these costs don't always show up neatly in a report, but they absolutely show up in terms of missed service level agreements, stretched teams, stressed teams, in fact, as well, and poor customer experience. So then there's also the cost of legal exposure. Now, when an incident is investigated, the question isn't just what happened here then, it's how quickly was this detected? What monitoring did you have in place? What reasonable steps did you take to identify and mitigate this risk early? Now, if there's a long delay between an incident occurring and anyone realizing that it's happened, that gap is very hard to defend, especially if the controls relied on informal check-ins or processes that weren't being consistently followed. And finally, there's the human cost. Lone workers who believe help would arrive slowly or believe that help might not even arrive at all are more likely to feel anxious, they're more likely to disengage, they're more likely to take stress-related absence or even leave their role entirely. And over time, that makes lone worker positions harder to fill and harder to retain, especially in already pressurized sectors. But across all of this, the pattern is still the same. The later you find out that something is wrong, the worse the outcome tends to be. Let's take a quick look now at why traditional measures don't always work. So if you employ lone workers, there's a good chance you already have controls in place. Risk assessments, health and safety training, scheduled welfare check-ins, panic alarms, escalation procedures. On paper, most organizations can point to something or a bunch of things like this that looks sensible. The problem isn't that these controls are wrong as such, it's that many of them depend on perfect human behavior, which simply doesn't happen. So take scheduled check-ins, for example, where a manager calls to check on a worker at regular intervals. In theory, that works well, because if they don't answer their call, maybe something's wrong. But where do you draw the line at how often the manager needs to call? Is it every 10 minutes? Because that kind of feels claustrophobic. Is it every couple of hours? That sort of runs the risk of an incident going undetected for far too long. And besides, this process relies on several assumptions. So firstly, it relies on the manager remembering to make the calls in the first place. Secondly, it relies on the worker actually managing to pick up those calls. Thirdly, the manager has to actually bother to do something about it when a call is missed. Because let's be fair, most missed calls are going to be put down to they're just busy. Let's talk candidly about this. Lone workers are busy and aren't always paying attention to their phones. And even if you're asking the worker themselves to make the phone call, so call me every time you leave a visit, for example, or call me every 30 minutes, it can seem like such a nuisance interruption, especially if they're busy with a customer or if a job has overrun. And over time, because of all these factors, missed phone calls in both directions become normalized, meaning that when a real emergency happens, the signal is weaker than it should be. Other measures, such as SOS and panic alarms, are limited too. So panic alarms, they assume that the worker can recognize the danger early enough and that they can access the device for raising that alarm, and that they can actually actively physically raise the alarm. But in many lone worker incidents, all of that isn't possible. The worker may be injured, they may be unconscious, they may be physically restrained, or in a situation where visibly asking for help would actually escalate the risk. Don't get me wrong here, by the way, it's great to give workers a way to raise the alarm. You absolutely should be doing that. But the Health and Safety Executive in the UK is very clear on this point. Relying on workers to summon help is not sufficient on its own, particularly where there's a risk of sudden illness, injury, or violence. And the pattern that we see cropping up again and again in lone worker incident reviews is this. The procedure existed, the worker was trained, and the check-ins were planned, but when the problem happened, it simply wasn't surfaced early enough. And that's the gap that most organizations struggle to close. So I want to take you through 7 automations that can massively reduce the impact of manual human judgment and help you to detect risk much faster. But before we talk about those specific automations, it's important to understand the basic infrastructure that you need in place for early detection to work. So at a very simple level, protecting lone workers comes down to 3 basic things. The first is knowing where someone is. The second is knowing whether they're active. And the third is giving them a reliable way to call for help. Now, if you can do those 3 things consistently, then everything else becomes possible. It helps if you have some infrastructure in place to support this. So I'm going to explain this in terms of Sense Workplace technology because that's what we use, but the principles apply whatever system or technology that you choose. So the first piece to put in place is some sort of wearable. Now, the reason for going wearable is because for lone workers who are moving around sites, traveling between locations, or working away from desks, safety systems only work if the signal stays with the person. Now, mobile phones are often used for this, but they're limited. So they rely on GPS. That's a problem in its own right. They're not always allowed or practical to use, and they require people to actively interact with them, not to mention making sure that the right permissions are switched on, etc. You've also got to make a decision such as, do we pay to roll out an entire network of mobile phones for our workforce, or do we require workers to bring their own mobile phones in with some sort of bring your own device policy, which you can do, but a lot of people don't like mixing work and personal. So wearable devices like Sense badges or Sense tags solve that problem. They're clipped to a pocket or a belt or a bag, and they're carried throughout the shift. So they provide continuous location and movement data without the worker having to do anything differently to what they're already doing. So this means that the system can see when someone last moved, whether they may have fallen, whether they've stayed in one place longer than expected, and it shows you this whether or not the worker is able to take action themselves to let you know. The second piece of infrastructure is accurate location technology. And actually, I'd even go as far as saying accurate indoor location technology. So that's because GPS is fine outdoors, but most lone worker incidents don't happen in open fields. They happen inside buildings. And in an emergency, knowing simply that someone is at the site is not enough. You need to know where they are inside it, which can get very difficult, especially when it comes to big or complex buildings. Now, for Sense Workplace customers, that's where fixed indoor gateways come in. So these are simple plug-in devices that you place around a building. You could place them in entrances, on certain floors, or in key rooms, as many or as few as you like, depending on the level of location detail you require. So what these gateways do is they detect the nearby wearable badges or tags, and they establish accurate indoor presence automatically. You can use whatever technology stack you like for this, as I've mentioned, but Sense Workplace does make it very easy to see where people are inside a building. So the third piece in this puzzle is visibility. All of this data and information needs to feed into some sort of real-time dashboard that your supervisors can see. So we have this in Sense Workplace. It's called Sense Presence. And this gives your supervisors a clear view of who's on site, who's working alone, when somebody last moved, etc. This is how you move away from blind phone calls to active and accurate lone worker safety information and monitoring. Finally, the fourth piece is automation. So once you have reliable signals in place, presence data, location information, movement information, interaction, you can use automation to turn those signals into action. So instead of waiting for someone to notice a problem, the system reacts automatically when something deviates from normal. So if a check-in gets missed, or if there's no movement detected, or if there's been a delayed departure from a certain site, or if somebody has activated an SOS alarm in a certain location. So those are the kinds of things you can automate. And actually, I've already promised to show you 7 easy automations that will help you do all this. So I think now is probably a good time to walk through these. Each of these automations is a simple workflow. If you use Sense Automate, you can build each of these in less than an hour, and you don't need to be a software engineer to do it. For the purpose of this video, though, I'll describe the logic in terms of if this happens, then do that. So the first automation is automated lone worker identification. And this is usually the starting point because everything else builds on it. If you don't know who's working alone, then how can you protect those people? So to set this up, you define what working alone means in your environment. The most common rule is simple. If a worker's badge or tag is detected on site and the head count on that site is 1, then apply a lone worker status to that person. You can also set this up based on distance, though, if that doesn't work. For example, if someone is more than a certain distance away from the nearest colleague, you could also class them as a lone worker. This is helpful if you have sites where multiple people work, but they're spread quite far apart from each other and are not expected to interact with each other throughout the shift. So once that rule is saved, it runs automatically. As soon as the conditions are met, the system tags the worker as alone, and that tag can be used to switch on other workflows or additional protections without anyone needing to notice or manually record that somebody is working alone. In fact, one of our facilities management clients used this automation across 6 of their higher risk locations. So beforehand, they had dozens of lone working shifts each month where nobody was explicitly aware that the worker was alone. But after enabling this rule, unprotected lone working instances dropped by over 90%. So the first step should always be awareness and visibility, which is why this is such an important foundation workflow to build. The second workflow is automated site check-in and safe checkout. So this is all about people arriving and leaving their shifts at various sites. And to set this up, you would simply tell the system when a badge or tag is detected by a gateway at one of yours or your client's sites, the system records a check-in. They mark the worker as present. When the device hasn't been detected for a short period, let's say 5 minutes, it records a checkout and marks the visit complete. You can then layer timing rules on top of this. So for example, if a worker hasn't checked in by a certain time after a shift has started, you could flag a missed arrival. Or if they're still present well after the shift has ended, you could flag this as an exception. Actually, there's another workflow that covers this, and I'll talk about that one next. But either way, this shows you who is present and where, without needing them to sign in on sheets or to scan QR codes or to make phone calls to say they've arrived. And it gives you defensible proof of presence, not just for safety, but for timesheets, payroll, and even invoicing. The next automation is called the delayed departure flag. Now, this one works best when it's combined with check-in data and shift schedules. So to configure this, you define an acceptable buffer after a worker's scheduled finish time. If their badge or tag is still detected beyond that window, the system marks their status as delayed departure. This buffer is adjustable, so I would say that longer buffers work better for long visits or full day shifts because these are more likely to overrun by a small amount of time. Shorter buffers make more sense for multiple short visits, especially where you're expecting people to be in and out within a very strict timescale, such as community healthcare roles. One security services company who uses Sense Workplace actually used this automation across their overnight patrols. So within 2 months of switching this automation on, the system had actually flagged 14 delayed departures. Now, 12 of these were basically just colleagues sticking around for a chat with whoever was taking over their shift, but 2 of them required follow-up because quite serious fatigue was identified, and a handful of the rotors were adjusted before that risk escalated. The fourth automation is scheduled safety check-ins, or as some of our clients have chosen to name this, the reverse SOS. So unlike manual SOS calls, where a worker raises the alarm if something goes wrong, the reverse SOS is set up by defining a check-in interval where workers need to tap a button to say they're fine. Now, the interval for this will highly depend on context. But for example, let's say every 15 minutes, the worker needs to tap that button to say, I'm fine. And the workflow is simple. The worker is prompted to confirm that they're safe. If they do, nothing happens. If they don't, then the system waits a short period and sends a reminder because they may have had their hands full the first time. And if there's still no response, it escalates to a supervisor with the worker's location. So what you configure in here isn't an alarm, it's a rule that says silence equals concern. Tapping a button to say you're fine is much easier than trying to call or message your supervisor. And the fact that help can be sent, even if you're not in a position to raise the alarm, for certain workers is a huge positive. So, for example, a healthcare provider we work with actually used this for workers who were attending high-risk home visits on their own. So managers had previously relied on phone calls in between visits. So, hi, I've just finished with Mr. Smith. I'm now moving to Mrs. Jones. But after switching to reverse check-ins, staff actually reported feeling safer. And on several occasions, missed check-ins triggered an early follow-up that actually managed to stop a situation from escalating. And the reason this was so helpful is because in some situations, staff didn't feel comfortable raising the alarm in front of a person where a confrontation was likely. This next automation is called no movement detected. So you configure this by defining how long someone can reasonably remain still in their role. You would use movement data from the Sense badge for this, so the system checks whether a worker has moved within whatever window you define, for example 5 minutes, and if they've not, it automatically escalates and shares their last known location with the nearest colleague. Now, if you're using Sense tags, you can achieve a similar outcome by defining expected movement between zones and flagging when someone remains in the same place too long. The Sense tags themselves don't give actual movement data, but they can tell you where somebody is. But if you are using the Sense badge, you can detect actual movement, and you can even enhance this workflow with hard fall detection. So heavy impacts would trigger alerts instantly rather than waiting for a no movement threshold. This automation seems to have the most impact at getting a rapid response to situations that could actually be extremely serious, but which previously may have gone unnoticed for, in some cases, up to 2 hours. The sixth automation is the automated welfare and well-being check-in. So this one is set up on a longer timer as it has a more long-term goal in mind. You could think of this like a pulse survey, and if you've ever worked in HR, you'll know all about that kind of thing. So the way this works is that you send a simple welfare survey out to your lone workers every 30 days. Now, this probably only needs to be a lightweight single question survey with a multiple choice answer, such as, how are you feeling at work, happy or sad? Now, if the response is positive, the timer resets, and if the response is negative, or maybe even if 2 consecutive prompts are ignored, the workflow escalates to a manager or HR contact who can then reach out and perform whatever well-being check-in you feel is appropriate in that context. Now, this isn't about emergencies, this is about spotting patterns of stress or disengagement that are otherwise very hard to pick up on when people work alone. And finally, we have the process for the manual SOS button. So this is configured by defining what action on a badge or tag counts as an SOS. For example, a long press or a double press. Whatever you define that as, when that action happens, the system raises a high priority alert, shares the worker's location with supervisors and nearby colleagues, and starts the escalation process immediately. The location side of this is very important, and a housing association actually used this with their estate staff who had previously been relying on phone calls for SOS alerts. So over 12 months, SOS was triggered 14 times with this association, and the key improvement was response speed. Average acknowledgement dropped from 12 minutes to under 3 minutes. Combined with precise location information, help was much easier to send. So together, these 7 workflows, or a selection of them, turn lone worker safety from something manual and full of gaps to something consistent and automatic. And the impact is usually immediate. It shows up in places you're probably already measuring. Let's have a quick look at what you can expect in terms of results. So the first and most obvious change is the speed of detection. Traditional lone worker controls often only surface problems at the next scheduled check-in. Depending on how your operation is set up, that could be 60, 90, or even 120 minutes later after something has already gone wrong. But with automated check-ins, movement detection, and presence-based alerts, that window collapses. So across organizations using these workflows, it's typical to see issues detected 30 to 60 minutes earlier than with manual processes. So in incapacitation scenarios, detection often even drops to single-digit minutes. That speed matters because it changes the outcome. So injuries are treated sooner. Situations de-escalate before they get ugly, that kind of thing. Which leads directly to the second change you're likely to notice. The severity and cost of incidents drops. Cost modelling from the health and safety executive shows that severity is one of the biggest drivers of total incident cost. If you can shorten the time between incident and response, you typically see fewer cases progressing to what we would class as extended absence, which lowers the average cost per incident and requires less investigation and is less likely to lead to escalation. Even a small reduction in severity can have a big financial impact, so preventing just one incident from crossing that 7-day absence threshold can avoid tens of thousands of pounds in direct and indirect costs. The third change you're likely to notice when you put these automations in place is reduced manual overhead. So when detection is automated, supervisors stop spending time chasing missed calls and manual attendance information. Organizations using a combination of these workflows commonly report 2 to 5 hours per week per supervisor reclaimed from manual lone worker checks. And there are fewer unknown status moments at the start and end of shifts. So that means less reactive firefighting when something goes wrong. Who's in? Where are they? And more time spent managing operations rather than looking for people and reconstructing events. So the fourth change you're likely to notice is stronger, more defensible compliance. When you're using these workflows, you'll likely find that when incidents are reviewed down the line, the conversation shifts significantly. So instead of people saying, hey, why didn't anybody know about this? The question actually becomes, what did the system detect and when? And you probably have an answer for that too. Automated workflows create consistent application of controls. They provide clear evidence of monitoring and escalation and far fewer gaps that are difficult to explain after the fact, which in turn strengthens your duty of care position and reduces your legal exposure when incidents are reviewed, either internally or externally. And finally, there's the change that doesn't always show up on a balance sheet, but it often has the biggest long-term impact, which is worker confidence and productivity. So when lone workers know that somebody knows where they are, when they know that missed check-ins will be noticed, and when they know that help will arrive quickly if needed, they go to work feeling more supported. And that confidence translates into better engagement, lower stress-related absence, and even better retention, especially in lone worker roles that are often hard to fill. Look, lone working will always involve a degree of risk. Okay, that's something you can't really avoid. After all, services still need to be delivered, sites still need to be covered, and people will continue to work alone until the end of time. You can't stop this, but what you can do is make sure that the risks associated with lone working are anticipated. You can make sure they're more visible, and you can make sure that you respond to them faster. What we've shown in this workthrough is that by using a small number of very simple signals, such as presence, movement, time, and applying automation to those signals consistently, it becomes possible to detect risk earlier and respond faster. And that's without adding awkward extra steps for your lone workers or for your supervisors. Now, if you want to explore what this could look like in your own organization, there are 2 easy next steps. If you want to put these automations in place for yourself, you can download the free playbook right now. It goes into full detail on each of the workflows, includes examples, and gives you a practical reference you can share internally. Or, if you prefer something more interactive, you can book a short, no obligation walkthrough with one of our friendly UK-based experts. In that session, we will help you to map your lone worker scenarios and risk points. We'll help you to identify where detection is currently slow or inconsistent, and we'll show you how presence, wearables, and automation could work in your environment and outline which workflows would make the biggest difference first. Nobody's going to expect you to implement everything at once. The aim is simply to help you understand what earlier detection could look like in practice and whether it would meaningfully reduce risk for your operation. So to download the video or to book a call with an expert, just use the link below. Thanks for watching.